Thank you, Joe. And yeah, thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to talk about my research here. Um, as Joe mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the College of Natural Resources. I'm also an extension specialist for the Center for Land Use Education here at Stevens Point. I'm here to share with you a little bit of research from my dissertation that I think would be pretty applicable, and hopefully it's applicable to you all today. But don't worry, it's only a portion of my dissertation. I am not going to be speaking, do the entire dissertation defense, right? Just focusing on a small portion, looking at conservation perspectives of governance in the Iowa Great Lakes. So a little bit of a background that many of you may know, right? The quality of freshwater systems, lakes, rivers, so on and so forth, are really impacted by the land use and land cover within the watershed that they reside. And they're extraordinarily sensitive systems, right? For example, there's a lot of agricultural land use within their watershed, or a lot of urbanization or impervious surface. Those can really impact the quality of lakes and rivers within a given watershed. But also recreational activity can also impact these natural resources as well, right? In order to mitigate some of these environmental pressures and maintain these resources, creating an effective governance structure can actually aid and help mitigating these pressures. And when we're talking about governance today, we're talking about not necessarily government, but governance. So thinking about all the public, private, and entities, along with all the stakeholders that are all working to protect a given geographical area. Although creating impactful governance to help mitigate these environmental pressures is important, doing so is very, very complex, right? Because impactful governance needs to address the physical components of the system, for example, the land cover, slope, all those kind of dynamics within the system, but also the community dynamics within the system too. So how are the resources being used? The current economic trends within the region and the population dynamics. And so doing so can be very difficult because it includes, like I mentioned earlier, both private and public entities that may have differing views of how this resource should be used or how valuable it is. This can lead to a variety of different barriers. Two that I'm going to touch on today because they're pertinent to this project are stakeholder barriers, right? It can be really difficult. Many of you may know this already from personal experience, but to include everybody's viewpoints and motivations in trying to manage particular resources or the best management for a natural area. There's also boundary barriers too, because our natural resources, like watersheds, don't necessarily perfectly align with our governmental boundaries. So for example, our cities, counties, states, and federal governments don't necessarily perfectly align within our watershed boundaries. So you have all these different entities that could be that are making decisions about a resource and impacting it, but they aren't necessarily working together. And so there are a lot of different governance structures that are talked about in literature. But the structure that we're going to be talking about today is polycentric governance structures because they're seen as kind of a way to alleviate some of these different boundary and stakeholder barriers within natural resource governance and freshwater systems. And so the best way to describe this governance structure are multiple overlapping entities that are all making decisions within the same geographic scope that have overlapping boundaries of the resource and making decisions. And this is my favorite diagram by Morrison et al. That kind of like that highlights polycentric environmental governance. So you can think of these different circles as different levels of governance. So you have local, maybe you could call this county or state, and then this is federal, right? And you can see that there's various different modes of centers of authority. So these are all different groups or entities all making decisions, right? And the polycentric system links them all together. Okay? And this helps reduce things, increases things like redundancy, so people can work together on different projects, reduces risks of failure because you have all these multiple organizations working together, increases collaboration. But there still needs to be empirical work to understand what it's like to actually work within this extremely complex governance system to mitigate environmental pressures, which is the entire purpose of this study, which is to provide an in-depth look of how conservation stakeholders view working within this polycentric governance system that's extremely complex and to mitigate multiple environmental pressures. We used a qualitative research design. We used 23 semi-structured interviews that were all conducted during the summer of 2020. They're supposed to be in person, but due to COVID-19 pandemic, they had to be over the phone. They were all confidential and audio recorded and then later transcribed for analysis. And essentially what we did is ask them a variety of different questions. For example, what kind of environmental pressures that they were trying to mitigate within the ecosystems that they're trying to protect. And then we looked at the various barriers that occur within polycentric governance. So thinking about, for example, what are the social, economic, and political barriers that these stakeholders need to navigate to protect this ecosystem, but also too, thinking about the interactions between these different stakeholder groups, how those may or may not cause barriers that exist. And then the final set of questions, we're looking at different solutions that can hopefully lead to better environmental outcomes within this system. And this is just a generalized breakdown of our participants. We had 23 stakeholders participate in the interviews. They lasted about an hour long each, totaling over 1,000 minutes of interview time. There's various levels of organizations in terms of the scale at which they work, whether or not they're government or non-governmental. We had almost an even split between those that work full-time in conservation and those that volunteer. And then the average years of experience working in this area was and on these issues was about 17 years. So the study area is the Iowa Great Lakes. It's in northwest Iowa, located in Dickinson County. As you can see, it's in some ways very typical of an Iowa landscape. Most of the land cover is dedicated to agricultural production. You have a variety of different communities that surround these the three lakes here, where you have west of Okoboji, east of Okoboji, and Spirit Lake. We also have a variety of different protected areas, and actually has the highest number of state parks within Iowa, all working to kind of within this region. Looking at a little bit closer view, you can see this is the outline of the watershed. You can also see this is to demonstrate the variety of different municipalities that all border the Iowa Great Lakes and are making decisions. But then you also have a variety of different protected areas that are owned by federal, state, NGO, or private organizations, all working in managing within this landscape. And this only shows those that own or are managing properties. There's a variety of other organizations that are also working to raise funds, influence programs, different policy, information campaigns, all working within this region. So it's a really interesting landscape and an ideal case study to kind of understand polycentric governance and what it's like to actually work in this system. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that this is a really large tourist destination. It's actually the only tourist based economy in Iowa at the county level. In 2019, they almost had $150 million spent on tourism in the county alone. And so it's a big economic driver, not only for the local economy, but for the county and state as well. But they do have some water quality issues that are emerging within these Great Lakes. And what does that tourism destination kind of look like? Looking a little bit closer at it, right? People flock from all over the state and sometimes the country to come visit and recreate in these lakes. This is essentially what it looks like on some of the larger holidays, like the 4th of July, Memorial Day. People come and recreate and participate and use these lakes. So it's a really interesting dynamic in terms of the various stakeholders involved and how valuable these lakes are. So we're looking at the some of the results. Participants, when they were asked about the environmental impacts or pressures that they're trying to mitigate within the Iowa Great Lakes region, every single participant stated that that agriculture was the main environmental factor that was impacting the Iowa Great Lakes. And others, and almost everybody mentioned the tourism, whether that be the on-the-water activities or the development of the shoreline, increased pervious surface, all meeting the increased demand for tourism industry within the Iowa Great Lakes. But delving a little bit deeper into this, so thinking about agriculture and tourism, that's how the rest of the presentation or the results are going to be kind of organized. Thinking about environmental impacts, it wasn't necessarily that everyone had a different kind of tone when it came to thinking about what the main environmental impacts were. So for example, this participant stated that that proportionally agriculture has a large role to play in water quality of the Iowa Great Lakes. The lakes are a function of their watershed, and agriculture, have a major responsibility in water quality. There's definitely those farmers or properties that impact more than others, and we can show you that through modeling. But some are impacting more than others, but they were all impacting. So some focused mainly on agriculture as the main environmental pressure, but others had kind of a softer tone in terms of describing agriculture in the region, right? This participant said, I think farmers too often get thrown under the bus. But farming practices clearly are impacting the lakes, but we've learned that with a small adjustment to your farming practice, whether that be a buffer strip, cover crop, no-till, can really make a huge difference talking about the water quality impacts. And so when it came to the emphasis placed on different environmental pressures, some were more focused on certain environmental impacts than others, right? And this was evident too in when people were talking about tourism as well, right? These participants said the weekend warriors, they come up there sailing across the lake at 50 miles an hour with their boats and jet skis, and they're tied up by the hundreds, maybe thousands in Miller's Bay, which is pictured here on the left. And there's all the litter, all the human waste going into that water. And you go over there on a calm morning during a weekday, and there's shiny beer cans and litter in the lake. It's just tragic, right? And this participant also focused less on the litter like this participant did, and more on the aquatic vegetation. So they also mentioned the high number of boats tying up in, and they described them as monstrous boats. They drop their anchors, and every time they pull up their anchors, they pull up a bunch of plant material. And they stated, you can't tell me that years of that happening isn't impacting the water. And specifically, it's changing the ecosystem of this bay. And they're referring to Miller's Bay, a really popular tie-up destination. Also associated with tourism was this development pressure to continue to develop not only on the shoreline, but also elsewhere in the community to meet this growing demand for tourism in the county. And in for the Iowa Great Lakes. And for example, this participant stated that Bridges Bay, for me, I'm really uncomfortable with that whole development because they took out an entire oak savanna. I'm sorry to say this, but it's a really disgusting show of architecture and land management, right? So they were pretty still upset about this particular development of property that went through. Yeah. And so when they're talking about some of these environmental pressures and how they work to mitigate them, they mostly came across a variety of different social barriers that interfered with their ability to actually mitigate those. And the root cause of those were really the voluntary nature of the conservation programs and mitigation efforts in the region. And that was really frustrating for them because they felt like they had to convince stakeholders that one, they were causing an environmental problem, but then also two, convince them that they should do something about it. And they really felt like there was a lack of participation from agriculture and tourism stakeholders. Delving into that from both environmental pressure standpoints, thinking about the social barriers in terms of agriculture, they really felt that there were conflicting goals between the conservation stakeholders and agricultural stakeholders. This participant stated, they tend to cite that we've got to make hay when the sun shines, sort of ethos, right? And they say they can't afford to take land out of production and put it into conservation practices, which is a large part of a lot of our stakeholders. What they did was trying to mitigate agricultural pressures. And some felt that this idea, right, was really caused by incentives. This participant stated, in my opinion, the federal crop insurance program provides a huge incentive for farmers to farm as much as possible, even if it's not making money. And then we have a smaller amount of money to pay for conservation practices to clean up the pollution caused by corn and soybean production. And so many of them felt that the incentives were really high through programs like the federal crop insurance program to continue to increase production. And they felt like there wasn't enough money to help mitigate those environmental pressures. And there seemed to be, in general, a frustration with conservation, with voluntary practices, which are the main, the main mode for mitigating environmental pressures in terms of agriculture. For example, this participant said, we've actually offered cooperatively the ability to have buffer strips either installed for them or done at very low costs, and they've refused. And the ability to come back and say, well, no, you can't say no, you've got to do that, isn't there, right? So they would get a little bit frustrated when they would, create a conservation plan, trying to implement it, and then having participants not, go through with it was pretty frustrating for our participants. The social issues for the tourism industry were very similar, but just different in some ways. So they also felt like there was conflicting goals, and they stated that there's any sort of competition, it's how fast can we expand tourism in this region at the expense of the lake. And so they felt like their goal was to try to protect these lakes in a variety of different ways. And they felt like the tourism industry was really just focused on trying to increase the number of visitors, increase the number of boats on the water, rentals, and development, which was pretty frustrating for our participants. And they also felt like there was a lack of rules for lake use, whether that be the size of the boats allowed on the lakes, whether it be the amount of the type of use that you were allowed to do on the lakes, was pretty frustrating for them as well. Some described large, giant boats that they felt weren't were too large for this system. I mean, it created this conflicting use of the lakes problem that was pretty prevalent throughout. Some were more concerned than others. For example, this participant says it tends to cite it as an overall public waters issue where people come and party and do things, maybe have loud music, so on and so forth. And it's just, you don't do that. When you do, and when you do that, you've taken half of the people out of the equation. You're not going to take your family down there and witness all of that and expose themselves to this type of behavior. We describe as kind of like party cove kind of behavior, and how fair is that? This participant stated, right? And some were a little bit less concerned. This participant said, from a personal standpoint, yeah, sometimes it's a bummer. Personal angler standpoint, sometimes it's a bummer when you can't get the lake to settle down because there's so many boaters and jet skiers running around, and the fishing kind of goes to crap because of that. It can really be troublesome. But if you have the privilege to time your visits and how you approach using the lakes, then there's more access to the ability to do the things that you would like to do on it, like different types of boating, like canoeing, fishing, so on and so forth. But most of the participants that I talked to had a plan to avoid high traffic days or times. So if it was a high traffic season during the summer, they would go really early in the morning if they wanted to go fishing or canoeing, or they would just go during the week and avoid the weekends. So when it came to solutions to these issues, they were kind of a variety of different solutions that were proposed, but there were some common themes between them. Some wanted like policy change in both arenas. Some wanted larger scale policy change, and some were focused more on pushing more existing practices within this structure. So again, thinking about it from, demonstrating from the agriculture perspective first, and we'll talk about tourism. From agriculture, everybody seemed that they wanted better policy, but everyone had differing opinions about what better meant. So for example, this participant wanted an expansion of voluntary practices. They stated, I like voluntary conservation because you get a really happy customer at the end of the day. If you start telling people what to do, X, Y, Z, they'll do it, but they're not going to be very happy. So I don't think I'd want to force people to do stuff or put regulations and rules on things. I would probably just increase conservation payments, make them better, because the incentive is just there. So they essentially stated, we have the will, the want to do it, but we just don't have enough funding or the resources to actually implement this. Others stated that they wanted more mandatory practices to some level or not. Some wanted larger scale change and restrictions in agriculture, but this participant had an interesting idea, stating that, where agriculture can have a more impact on the lake, we could create an area with more compliance. So for example, say we could create a buffer around the lake, which is the water source, that you might have a set of rules that extends out that distance. And it creates higher levels of standards for people who live and work on that land, and maybe even beyond that. So some sort of extra restrictions to help mitigate this really valuable pressures from agriculture that that reduces the impact that they're having. When it came to tourism, it was also very similar, right? People wanted some sort of rules in lake restrictions, right? Some people talked about limiting tie-ups, for example.
Hey, Austin.
Yeah.
Your audio seems to be a little bit garbled. I don't know, maybe do you have a VPN that's on, or are there any potential things sucking your bandwidth right now? I apologize for the interruption.
Has it been that way the whole time?
No, it just happened.
Okay, let me check my audio. Can you hear me better now?
Keep talking.
Hello, hello, hello.
Yeah, that seems like it's good. Thanks.
That's good. Okay, no problem.
Apologies for the interruption.
Oh, no worries. Cool. So yeah, some people wanted more lake restrictions, and it depended on what the person had. Each person seemed to have like different types of lake restrictions that were kind of brought up. So this participant said, instead of allowing 700 boats to tie together and putting all that pressure and human waste and litter into the water and system, maybe we should design policies and regulations that allow people to have their enjoyment without being reckless. Meaning that you could require no more than 2 boats with 10 people to tie up together, and you have to be 10 feet apart. Other ideas were having different poles that you could only tie up to in the water, or having different days with different uses to include all the other types of recreational opportunities. I think most participants had a similar tone of that most people coming and enjoying these lakes might not necessarily know that they're having a negative impact because they're focusing on enjoying themselves and on vacation. So talking about designing policies that can allow people to have their enjoyment without causing too much harm, right? And then some participants thought about a change in marketing. This participant said, the economy tends to spin around the bars and restaurants because that grabs people's attention. But maybe we could be a nature destination, right? They have the highest number of state parks in the state of Iowa. And this participant said, you could explore up here a different public area every day of the week all summer. And why wouldn't you? But just people don't necessarily know that you can do those activities here. And so putting out that information as like a marketing campaign to have to highlight kayaking and fishing in some of the other lakes, the smaller lakes, could be a great way to increase tourism in the region without necessarily having it increasing it on the large lakes that are experiencing the most impact. And finally, participants wanted more data. So essentially, they felt that we need more data to really understand what the tourism impact is on the lakes specifically. They felt that if you're going to figure out some way to reduce the load, you need to necessarily know exactly what this availability or the sustainable limit is, so that we're not making policies and rules that are draconian, right? That are over regulatory, that still allows for the satisfaction levels to maintain themselves, so people still want to come and enjoy themselves on the lake and contribute to the local economy. But that quality of life can still maintain itself, and that the lakes can be sustainable. And so thinking about the discussion, when you're reviewing the results and thinking about connecting it to the literature, the environmental pressures that are facing the Iowa Great Lakes aren't necessarily that unique. Like we said before, it's pretty well documented that agriculture, urbanization, and development and recreational activities can impact and do impact freshwater systems. But what is interesting is that these stakeholders are really trying to mitigate all three kind of at once, and they're trying to deal with all of them at the same time in this really complex structure, which is really interesting, but also very challenging. And so we kind of provided some empirical evidence about the difficulty of relying on almost exclusively voluntary measures within trying to mitigate within a polycentric governance system to mitigate these environmental pressures. It was really difficult for participants. And that the current structure essentially hinders stakeholders' ability to mitigate environmental pressures, which is challenging. And they also kind of disagree on how they should change, right? How they should develop programs and policies to mitigate these environmental pressures. And that's okay, right? Coming into regular meetings and conflict and coming up to these solutions is all part of a healthy governance structure. But regardless of the change that they seem to kind of push, the policy or program that they should center around incentivizing participation and governance from these other stakeholders like agriculture and tourism industry, so that you can create and have buy-in from those policies and whatever programs are being designed to hopefully sustainably manage this resource. And this is especially true as emerging issues seem to be intensifying due to climate change. So after this study was conducted the following year, continued issues from lower water levels. There was a short-term drought that caused a lot more of the same issues that were there to intensify and get worse. And the same for other issues like zebra mussels that were becoming just a continued nuisance that were there that continue to exacerbate within this region. And I think my favorite quote from the entire study was this participant when they're talking about these issues and whether or not the management is going to be in the management of the Iowa Great Lakes is going to be sustainable going into the future. They had stated, well, it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? These resources can only take so much. That is related to that tipping point. And at what point does the last cut tip us into a poor water quality state or unhealthy state? Which invasive species that is the next down the road that's going to be the one that really upsets the apple cart and takes us and causes all kinds of problems? And so it's really imperative to try to address these issues going forward to hopefully incorporate all the stakeholders in governance to hopefully help mitigate these environmental pressures. And kind of going forward in future work that I'm going to be doing in some capacity in the Iowa Great Lakes region, we only examined one stakeholder group, right? The conservationist stakeholders group. We really got their opinion on these issues. And so moving forward, we want to examine the other stakeholder groups to get their perspectives on all these issues as well, to hopefully build pathways of common ground that can hopefully lead to more involvement in some capacity. Next, we're going to be focusing on the tourist industry in the Iowa Great Lakes. Hopefully in the next summer or two, I get down there to do more research. Essentially, we're going to gain their perspective on the current environmental conditions that are occurring within the Iowa Great Lakes to get their perspective on them. What they think about the current conservation efforts within the region and how they view those conservation practices and how they feel that they contribute to those. We'll talk about their role in governance, whether or not they feel like they're actively involved in these management decisions and trying to mitigate some of these environmental pressures. And then get their opinion about what would be an effective policy or programs to help mitigate these negative impacts. And with the overarching goal to hopefully incorporate these stakeholders more actively in governance, in hopes that we can aid in creating policy and programs that can hopefully sustainably manage the Iowa Great Lakes into the future. So that kind of wraps everything up for me. I just want to thank my support for this research at Iowa Graduate College and the graduate for professional and professional student government that provided funds for this research, as well as the Friends of Lakeside Lab that provided a fellowship for me to do this research, and also to the Iowa Great Lakes conservation community for participating in the interviews and providing that input was really helpful. And if you want to read more about this, paper was that a lot of the results that I talked about today were published in this recently in this in Society of Natural Resources. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out. Thank you. Any questions?
All right. Well, thanks, Austin. That was really interesting. And there's lots to unpack there for sure. And I am not in Iowa. I'm in southern part of Michigan, but we face many of the same issues that stakeholders there are facing, and I think that's true probably throughout much of the upper Midwest. So at this point, I will remind participants that you have the option to submit questions via the question and answer function. Again, just take your mouse, hover it over the bottom of your screen until you see a Q&A button. You can click on that and submit your question, and I'll make sure to forward it on to Austin and we can pick his brain. He's already defended this dissertation, so he's gotten over the hard part now. Will be easy relative to that. So, okay, I don't see any of the questions in the chat now, so I wanted to kind of ask a few questions that I had as I was listening. Can you talk about, some of your recommendations were based around, we want to increase political involvement in the governance structures, whatever, maybe political isn't the right word, but we want to increase involvement in the governance structures. And we're seeing political involvement, I think, become more polarizing in kind of national, state, local politics, but we're also seeing a move from national to local politics, in my layman's opinion, as folks get frustrated with the federal political system. So can you talk about how kind of the trajectory and the polarization in the current political climate relates to what you've been sharing here and might augment it as it moves into the future?
Yeah, it's a deep question. And that was something that I think was brought up in an undertone in some of the interviews that I did. The unwillingness to work with one another in different political realms. And I think that's my view, I guess, on that. It would be, I think that's why it's even more important to get together more, right? And speak to one another to kind of come up with shared solutions and goal identification, right? Because I don't think anybody wants the Iowa Great Lakes to go, to go into an unhealthy water state, right? Everybody wants to protect them, you would think. And so I think coming together, and there might be some disagreement on the solutions and the program ideas. We even saw that within this kind of focused group of just conservation stakeholders, right? Everyone had a different idea about what should be the solution in dealing with some of these environmental pressures. And so I think getting together and talking about them and kind of sketching out plans would be kind of the first step to hopefully bring down some of those barriers. And I think, if you, in the literature, conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how conflict is kind of carried out, right? If you can come to conflict if two people have a different idea about how to solve the problem, right? There's probably some middle ground there that could be made to come up with the best possible solution. Simple example, but easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done, that's for sure. Let's see, I've got. Okay, so in the regions of Iowa with heavy tourism, do they also have a significant portion of the local tax base that's being shared that comes from shoreline property owners? So the person who's asking this question, Patrick, says that where he is in Wisconsin, the heavy tourism places can have a local tax base as 50 to 90% of local taxes. And so then, pointing that out provides some leverage as you're trying to work on lake management.
Yeah, and that was something that was brought up too in the interviews, right? I think something that was kind of interesting was that, I talked about agriculture and tourism kind of separately here, but those local tax benefits benefit the agricultural stakeholders as well, and that was brought up multiple times in the interviews. I don't know the exact tax rates of those properties, but yeah, I would say it is kind of a factor where it is more intertwined, and there is benefit from those.
Okay. So you mentioned that, the producers in the watershed were not using the programs to improve water quality as much as some of the conservation professionals would like. And I think this is probably a common issue, challenge broadly. And one of the participants indicated that they felt like the payment amounts were the thing that was the issue. And when I talk with folks, sometimes I also hear about other inefficiencies in terms of it's difficult, and I use that word broadly, but it's difficult to participate in the programs. There's a lot of red tape. There's some technical issues, those sorts of things, as opposed to just the dollar amount that's offered for the participation in the program. So I guess I'm kind of curious, did you encounter those sorts of challenges when talking with folks as well, or did you see hints of those challenges in the conversations that you had as well?
Yeah, I would say more hints, right? And I think that was something that was a big push, was just improving them more broadly. I think that was kind of an undertone in discussion. Trying to figure out ways to get money to projects quicker was something that was kind of discussed in broad strokes, both in terms of in the money in general was a major issue. So for example, they would talk about shoreline development, right? And they would say that it's just difficult to find the money to buy shoreline, right? To open it up or to have it public or protect it, right? It's just very expensive and it's hard to find that money quickly. And that was kind of a broad undertone too when it came to agriculture, was trying to improve those programs, the existing framework. And yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a universal challenge.
Yeah, but it wasn't explicitly stated, I should say.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So another question for you from a participant. So this person said that some of their watershed farmers don't use the lake. So how do you gain their cooperation if reducing the flow of phosphorus to the lake doesn't necessarily benefit them directly?
Yeah.
That's what I'm reading between lines here.
What's that?
I think I read that correctly.
Yeah. Is the one in the chat here some of our watershed? Yeah, and so that's kind of what drawing on from the literature, right? Is really focusing on trying to create incentives for participation, right? If those incentives aren't there now, because they don't use the lake, because they don't, they aren't there, you can create incentives, try to create incentives to have them participate in those programs, in governance, so that they become more involved within the watershed. And whatever those incentives are will probably be on a local to local basis, depending on the stakeholder.
Okay. One of the things that you talked about, kind of shifting gears, we've talked about the agricultural side of it a lot, but on the tourism side of it, there were some concerns expressed by some of the stakeholders around development and around the use of boats and kind of the creating of party coves and that sort of activity. I think that you said that you interviewed conservation professionals. So your interviews, do they include anybody who lives in those new developments or participates in the party cove type atmospheres? Do they see that as a problem? I guess is my question. And if so, how do they view solving it?
Yeah, and that's an interesting dynamic. I interviewed people that work professionally in conservation, and then also people that volunteer for different organizations. And that I think is going to be the thing that I think is the missing part, right? I think that's something that further research will kind of tease out, is kind of seeing how they view those behaviors and what they think about the environmental, different types of environmental pressures that come from different uses. I think would be really interesting. And I think it would be really interesting to interview or do a survey or try to get the perspective of the visitors, the tourists that come. If, is that on the top of their mind? Is it not?
Are there, I apologize, I'm blanking on the chart that you showed at the outset. Is there a strong lake association on this lake, and how did their views differ, or how could you compare and contrast those views toward other interviewees?
Yeah, so we collected a bunch of information about the different types of organizations, not the specific organizations themselves. I can't say what type of the specific type of organizations that participated in the groups, or I can't say that due to the IRB. But what was kind of interesting too, and this was in the paper, I delved into this a little bit further, but we thought we were going to have kind of these separate groups, like I'll go back to this slide here real quick. We kind of thought we were going to have different breaks of these different organizations where we would have only government, only NGO, only local, only state, federal, global, that kind of breakdown. But so we thought we were going to be able to compare different responses. So maybe local stakeholders that work for NGOs might think this, or local stakeholders that work for the government might think this. And so what we kind of found is during the interview process, people would talk about the multiple organizations that they were involved with. So we actually had that kind of part of our analysis became kind of useless, because many of these people worked and volunteered for multiple organizations, or so it didn't really, that sort of comparison to the different types of groups didn't really kind of make it into our analysis, because our participants were, they would fill out the survey that they worked for they worked for both, right? And then they volunteered for both, and then they would talk about different organizations, but others as well throughout the interview. So we kind of didn't feel comfortable making characterizations or deriving those things between different groups. So
do you think that suggests that the folks you interviewed have a decent sense for how to navigate in this polycentric governance structure, that they kind of know where the right places are to take particular needs? And so is in terms of like that, regardless of the structural level, there might be just the inability to get something done, political will or whatever reason, but then there it seems like maybe knowing where to go with a particular issue, what the right level is, and who to talk to, and where to try to work on it. Seems like that might suggest that they at least are collaborating well.
Yeah, and I thought that was and that was the thing that was interesting, was that when it came to the government or the conservation organization or stakeholders that we interviewed, they didn't really have a ton to say. It wasn't like in terms of inter-organizational conflict between different conservation groups. That there wasn't really a lot of conflict between them. And so I would say that the thing that you're right, that they did know where the problems were, and they had a lot of ideas about like how to solve them, but it was really the social barriers of interacting with these other stakeholder groups that they felt were mitigating their ability to do it. So they kind of felt like, we know what to do, we know how to stop it, but it's just trying to get the funding, trying to get the, and then if you get the funding, how do you get the practice on the landscape or a local ordinance? A big discussion too is how each of these towns had different ordinances. And so they're trying to deal with all those, trying to move through and navigate those was difficult too. So that's why we really focus on the social barriers, because that was kind of the main thing.
Sure. Okay, we got another question. So your participants are a pretty well-educated group and were mostly employees. Did you get out in the field and interview farmers in your watershed?
No, and that is going to be hopefully continued work as we go through. We just focused in on this because there wasn't a ton of work on looking at how conservation stakeholders view the work that they do and the programs that they work within, in particular in this kind of setting. And so that will hopefully be a future project where we get to go out and interview farmers in agriculture and other industries. I think that would be really important. So
yeah, there are a lot of follow-up questions here. I see a life's work in front of you if you choose it.
yeah, exactly, right. Just keep on going, right? Each next stakeholder group and try to figure out how they work together. So
yeah. Okay, we're starting to round to the end of the questions here, so I'm going to offer a last call for questions from participants. If you've got any questions for Austin, now's the time to submit them. And I'll take a brief pause here to see if anybody types anything in. Oh, you mentioned, I did have one other question. You mentioned a mandatory buffer around the lake. In that, was the person's vision a buffer around the lake shoreline or around kind of the watershed or the streams of the watershed? Were they thinking more in the watershed or both?
yeah, that was kind of just it felt very like in the moment and reading back, it was just kind of an idea that like, regardless, we need higher standards. They didn't go specifically whether it was the shoreline, whether it was the watershed, but essentially just trying to have some sort of limits for those that could have the greatest impact. So
yeah. Okay, well, I don't see any additional questions here. So at this point, I'm going to wrap up the webinar. Say thank you, Austin, for sharing your information, this research with us. I think it's really fascinating stuff. And, we can have all the natural science we want in the world, but if we don't know how to apply it and how to navigate the complex social systems and get that the conservation programs on the ground and get them through the governance, then we're never going to get anywhere. So appreciate you sharing this information, trying to help us as we all navigate similar things in our neck of the woods. So thank you.
oh, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. So, and thanks for all the questions. I really appreciate them. So
yeah. So for folks that are still on, this webinar will be recorded. I'll be sharing the recording on YouTube and through our webinar webpage, and you'll see an email from me in a week or so with that webinar link and recording. Thank you everyone for attending and have a good day. Take care.